thoughts in connection with the Book of Mormon and the story of its coming forth. You have in 1 Nephi a very good example of what's called a throne theophany vision, when Lehi sees God seated upon his throne surrounded by numberless concourses of angels. This is what's known as a throne theophany in scholarly literature today. We know that it's a very important part of a prophetic call, where a prophet is actually admitted into the presence of God. He hears himself called in the divine council. Isaiah is a good instance of this. And then he returns to earth with his commission to bear the message that he's received. Part of this is the writing of a heavenly book, or a transcript of a heavenly book, which is then handed over to the prophet. A good example of this in extra-biblical history occurs with the Prophet Muhammad, the founder of Islam, where the Quran is said to be an actual transcript, that heavenly text, the Kitab, the mother of the book, the preserved tablet. You have that in the Book of Mormon, where a document is actually given to Lehi, and he's told to read, and then he's told to proclaim that message to his people. The heavenly book idea has been heavily studied. The idea is that a divine being gives a book to a mortal. He commands him to read the book. He tells him to copy it, or even in one case with Ezekiel, to eat it, to ingest it, to really take it into himself. And then he's told to preach the contents of the book. And in the Book of Mormon, you have a classic instance of that throne theophany motif and the motif of the heavenly book. In fact, my friend and former missionary companion, Stephen Ricks, and I once gave a paper in Boston on the idea of the throne theophany vision. And we gave examples, roughly 20 or 25 of them, from ancient texts, and prepared a chart showing them. Among those, we included, just for the fun of it, 1 Nephi. And we found that 1 Nephi was one of the best of all those examples. It was as if Joseph Smith had somehow read all these other accounts and the scholarly literature about them, and then had composed 1 Nephi based on that notion. But in fact, we know he couldn't have done that. The scholarly literature hadn't been written yet. He would have to have traveled in time, come forward to the late 20th century to read the documents, to read the academic articles in order to go back and do what he supposedly did. One other item that I'd like to mention is the idea of the Moshiach. This is not to be confused with the Messiah. It's a different word. But there was an article done on this word, which occurs in the Hebrew Bible, but not in the King James Version or any other English version. The person asked the question, what is a Moshiach? And he answered it this way. He said, a Moshiach is a champion of justice in battle or against oppression. He's appointed by God. He liberates a chosen people from oppression. Preferably, it's a nonviolent deliverance, and he returns them to a state of justice. Now, I would submit that you should look at the story that's given in the book of Omni, the deliverance of the people there. You might even want to look at the name Mosiah, which may well be that name Moshiach, and describes that kind of action. That's the whole theme of the book, is nonviolent deliverance of a chosen people from an oppressive situation. Again, Joseph Smith probably never saw this word. Certainly he had not seen it by the time of 1828, 1829, when the Book of Mormon was being produced. He could not read Hebrew. He could barely handle English. And it took a scholar of the 20th century to track down the meaning of this word Moshiach. But again, it seems that Joseph Smith had come forward and read John Sawyer's article, and then went back and incorporated that into the Book of Mormon. I personally find Joseph Smith's own account of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon far more plausible than some notion of Joseph Smith doing time travel a la Star Trek to get his ideas from academic articles. Finally, a few small items that I think are worth mentioning. There's the matter of simile curses. Now, what are these? They're oaths that were taken, particularly in military contexts, in the ancient Near East. You find them among the ancient Hebrews. You find them among the ancient Hittites. And they almost always have to do with warfare situations. For example, a Hittite military oath might involve smashing some statues and saying, if we do not obey our commander, may we be smashed as these statues are smashed. Or they involve tearing clothing or something like that. We have an absolutely classic instance of the so-called simile curse in Alma chapter 46. And let me have a look at this. Let me read it to you. And you'll see, I think, how it applies. And it came to pass that when Moroni had proclaimed these words, and this is where Moroni is recruiting people basically for a defensive war, behold, the people came running together with their armor girded about their loins, rending their garments in token or as a covenant, that they would not forsake the Lord their God. Or in other words, if they should transgress the commandments of God, or fall into transgression, and be ashamed to take upon them the name of Christ, the Lord should rend them, even as they had rent their garments. Now this was the covenant which they made, and they cast their garments at the feet of Moroni, saying, We covenant with our God, that we shall be destroyed, even as our brethren in the land northward, if we shall fall into transgression. Yea, he may cast us at the feet of our enemies, even as we have cast our garments at thy feet, to be trodden under foot, if we shall fall into transgression. You could not have invented a better example of the ancient simile oath than that one, and yet it first arrived in our language in 1828, 1829, was published in 1830. Where did Joseph Smith get this? There's another item that I like to use in my classes when I teach Arabic, and that's the so-called cognate accusative. That sounds a little bit odd, but what is it? How can a cognate accusative, an Arabic grammatical point, serve as evidence for the Book of Mormon? Let me tell you what it is. A cognate accusative in Arabic is where a word is used, both the verbal form and a noun form of the same word is used to emphasize a point. Where you say, for example, I will hit Muhammad, a hitting. I have seen Zayd, a seeing. I have seen him, in other words. Does this occur in the Book of Mormon? It does, in a very nice example. And when I'm trying to explain cognate accusatives to my Arabic students, the form is also Hebrew, sometimes they don't get it. But then I turn to the Book of Mormon, and I give them an example from it. And it came to pass that while my father tarried in the wilderness, he spake unto us, saying, Behold, I have dreamed a dream, or in other words, I have seen a vision. This is Lehi speaking to his sons in 1 Nephi 8:2. What's going on here? Well, the first one is quite obvious. Behold, I have dreamed a dream. That's a classic cognate accusative. But the second one probably is also, or in other words, I have seen a vision. Now, we lose it in English a little bit because English is a hybrid language. You have the original Anglo-Saxon, then after the Norman conquest, you have this French or Latin overlay. For example, we have two words meaning the same thing. Handbook, good old Germanic, those single-syllable terms, handbook. Or you have the Latin-French manual from the Latin word manus, meaning hand. It means the same thing. There's an elevated word and a lower word. Well, in the case of this, you have, in other words, I have seen a vision. Seen is the Germanic word. Vision is the Latin word. You could have said, I've seen a seeing. That's what vision means. And that's what I suspect it was in the original. So Lehi says to his sons, Behold, I have dreamed a dream. That comes across in the English. Or in other words, I have seen a seeing. Classic cognate accusatives. Absolutely typical of ancient Hebrew and Arabic writing. And still true today in both those languages. But not common in English. In fact, on the whole, considered somewhat awkward and bad style. But it's a clue to the original language of the Book of Mormon, again, which was not English. What about Reformed Egyptian? What about that language or script that the Book of Mormon is supposed to have been written in? Is there such a thing? Yes, as a matter of fact, there is. People should not be mistaken into thinking that Reformed Egyptian is some kind of language. It's not. Egyptian is a script and a language, and we know that it was being reformed constantly throughout its history. You have hieroglyphic, you have hieratic, demotic, and eventually Coptic. The language is constantly shifting, as languages do over periods of time. Our own language, our own alphabet, is in some ways a form of Reformed Egyptian. Some of our letters go back into ancient times. The letter A, for example, may be an ox's head and things like that. The letter M may well be the ears at the top of the head of an owl. There are theories about those that suggest that our letters go